Great. Okay, thank you all very much. Before I start, I'm told that this is being filmed, so on its conclusion it will be the latest horror on the internet. There is no fire alarm expected today, so any fire alarm is to be treated as real, and we should await directions from the MGAA staff to safe evacuation. Okay, thank you. By way of very brief introduction, my name is Barney Winckler. I'm an insurance, general insurance sort of lawyer at Kennedy's. My interest in this subject started, I suppose, incidentally through work I do on the side with the IUA, who have a number of committees, including one that looks at developing technologies. And I've been involved in drones really as a sort of a coverage issue, as a new insurance product type issue. My colleague Stuart is an aviation lawyer, and so he understands the stuff like the law and what they actually are, and flight. So if you have any difficult questions, Stuart's your man. But we thought we would talk to you guys today about some of the main issues that we see as being relevant to how drones are going to become an increasingly important aspect of the economy and of daily life in civilian use, and what the implications are for that potentially for insurers. I'm told I have to start off by saying we have an events app, and if you put that on your cell phone, you can watch this afterwards at your leisure. So what we're going to do today is a fairly high-level run-through of some fairly major key topics areas. We're hoping to speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes at the absolute outside limit, so that if you have any questions at the end, there'll be time to go through those, our thoughts on those. Obviously we're happy to talk to you individually one-to-one at the end, should you so wish. All right, so the very basics. What is a drone? Obviously, if you're familiar with this area, this is a little bit sort of elementary, but it's worth just being clear about one thing. Drone is a colloquial term used for the part of an unmanned system which goes in the sky. There is always someone controlling it, and that person tends to sit on the ground, obviously, and they will control it through a station. They don't have to be as sort of high-end as some of the systems you see there. But a drone is part of an overall system, is the first obvious elementary point. And beyond that, a drone can take almost any form. It can be fixed wing, rotary wing. It can be adapted from a conventional aircraft. It can be purpose-built. At the moment, as you'll see from a lot of the images up there, one of the obvious and primary uses for drones at the moment is to obtain imagery. You get an eye in the sky. But their uses are not constrained or limited to that. I think that image is of a use of a drone being used to clean the telegraph wire you see. I don't know if that's how they do it when they use helicopters. I suspect not. But it's not all about imagery. The potential applications of drones are, carrying on to the next slides, quite wide. So you see on the screen there, drones actually being used in an agricultural context, drones flying over pipelines, and then at the bottom some images of things where we might see drones being used in the future. Oops, sorry, I'm finding this a bit tricky. Okay, that slide there, which I think is copyright to Amazon, is, if you like, a mock-up of what a delivery system used by Amazon Prime might look like if they get to a situation where drones are used to deliver everything to us on a daily basis in our urban environments. The reasons we'll come on to, that's actually probably slightly further off than we might expect, but there is a vision of the future in which these things are not something you see occasionally and think, oh, a drone. They'll be an everyday sight. And the best data we could, this is a pretty empty slide, I tried to get some data about how many drones are there flying around in our skies and what are they being used for. And that data isn't actually particularly easy to find in one place. Civil Aviation Authority, which is the government body which basically has responsibility for the control and use of domestic airspace in the UK, has the fact that there were 1.5 million drones sold in the UK by Christmas 2017. Now, the fact that what you might think is implicit in that is that drones can be pretty small and they can be consumer personal items. They can, that's absolutely right. And one suspects that the proportion of drones actually sold in the UK that are used for private recreational use is extremely high. I found a survey by a company called dronesdirect.co.uk that suggested that its memberships, 85% of their use was recreational. Interestingly, the one really striking statistic in all of their findings was that at the moment, 96% of users were male, so they're boys' toys. What attracted quite a lot of attention a couple of months ago was a report produced by PwC, which had some very striking predictions about how significant drones could become to the economy. So the headline figures were they had the potential within the next decade or so to increase UK GDP by 2%, £42 billion. There could be some 76,000 drones in commercial use, £16 billion of net productivity savings, huge job creation in the sector, and massive implications for wholesale and retail trade. If you read that report, those figures are very striking and impressive. How they've been arrived at is a little opaque. I don't see why PwC should give away, the inner magic of their workings. But as to how they've arrived at those conclusions, I don't know. I've not had the opportunity to discuss with them. But anyway, it is potentially something which is going to be, in big picture terms, economically significant to this country over the coming decades. What the report emphasises is that if this is going to happen, you're going to have a harmonious convergence of technology, societal acceptance, and regulation. And because these things can fall out of the sky and hurt people, I think it's almost taken as given that the availability of insurance as part of the risk management to make that growth happen harmoniously is expected to be there. Right. I'm going to hand over to Stuart, who's going to take you through the lawyer's part of this, which is the rules and regulations, what we have at the moment and how they're moving on. He'll then go through things right through to the end, where I will resume control over the sort of insurance sector specific bit. Stuart.
Thank you, Barney. As Barney says, I'm going to talk about the rules. So this can be quite dry, so apologies in advance, but I'll try to keep it as interesting and as relevant as possible. So this is tricky. There we go. So a number of laws and regulations in the UK actually touch the operation of a drone. There are two main ones which I'll talk about in a second, and I'll touch on a few later. We have the Air Navigation Order 2016 applies to all domestic airspace in the UK. That was amended this year, and I'll talk about those amendments because that's quite important stuff they've changed. And CAP 722 is the guidance, detailed guidance issued by the Civil Aviation Authority on how they expect drone operators to comply with the Air Navigation Order. Okay, so starting position, a small unmanned aircraft, a drone weighing less than 20 kilos. To a drone that small, one less than 20 kilos, the majority of the Air Navigation Order actually doesn't apply. But there are some specific sections within there that do apply to small unmanned aircraft. First and foremost, you must at all times maintain direct unaided visual contact with the drone, generally regarded to be within 500 meters. You also must not carry out commercial operations without CAA permission. And commercial operations is any activity where you're essentially receiving payment, valuable consideration. The third and fourth bullets there are greyed out because they don't come into force until November next year. Those were two of the changes that were brought in to the Air Navigation Order this July. Online competency will be mandatory for all pilots, and online registration will be mandatory for all unmanned operators. And there is a distinction there between operators and pilots. Previously, the navigation order just applied to the person in charge of the unmanned aircraft. Changes that came in this year implemented a distinction. I'll talk about that a bit more later, but essentially the operator, the small unmanned aircraft operator, is the person responsible for management of the drone, and the pilot is the person who has their finger on the button and are actually controlling or flying the thing. You also must not fly above 400 foot without permission from the CAA. You also must not fly in controlled airspace without permission from air traffic control. And you also must not fly in a flight restriction zone of a protected aerodrome. And there are several routes for permission there, but there's a defined list of protected aerodromes. The 400-foot rule, that previously only applied to drones over 7 kilos. There were changes to the navigation order. I think they acknowledged that allowing someone to fly a drone, even if it weighed less than 7 kilos, to an unlimited height was fairly silly. So they've blanket across the board now. 400 foot is the upper limit for flight of drone, unless you have CA permission. Small unmanned surveillance aircraft stick a camera on it. Most drones are equipped with cameras. That's kind of the point. They offer that perspective. You become a small unmanned surveillance aircraft, and there are additional restrictions. Everything I've just said still applies. You also must not, unless the CAA grants permission, fly over or within 150 metres of a congested area or an open air assembly of more than 1,000 people, or within 50 metres of any person, vessel, vehicle or structure. Larger than 20 kilos, the whole of the navigation order applies, and generally the operator will apply to the Civil Aviation Authority for broad exemptions from the navigation order in order to be able to operate their aircraft. Over 150 kilos, you're treated as an aircraft, and essentially the same rules that would apply to manned flight would apply to your unmanned aircraft. Okay, I've mentioned permissions a couple of times, very important. The restrictions on commercial operations or flying within the surveillance aircraft restrictions to 50 metres can be relaxed or varied if you have CAA permission. Now, the commercial operation is fairly simple. It just requires proof of pilot competency. You have to have done a course. You fill in a form. You provide an operations manual to the Civil Aviation Authority. You comply with a few other requirements, prove that you're insured, and they will give you your your permission for commercial operation, and that's valid for 12 months. And the CAA is saying that they're currently turning those applications around in 7 days. Previously was taking them over a month. And currently there are around 5,000 commercial operators in the UK, operators with permission for commercial operation. If you want to work within a congested area, over people, closer than 50 metres of any person, vehicle, vessel, structure, then the process is somewhat more complicated. You must apply. Essentially, generally, there are simpler routes of permission if you're flying smaller kit, but generally you have to apply to the Civil Aviation Authority and present an operating safety case. That requires you to present your operations manual, which you would do anyway as your commercial operator. You also must provide a system details document, which sets out the safety features of your equipment, and conduct a safety assessment for your operations. It's a very detailed process, a very expensive process, and is really only intended for the more complex commercial operations. Beyond visual line of sight, general rule is that you must maintain visual contact with your drone at all times. If you want to operate beyond visual line of sight, the Civil Aviation Authority must be satisfied that you present no greater hazard than manned aircraft. Now, as far as I'm aware, at the moment, there are no operators with a broad BVLOS permission. It's being considered, and there are areas where the CAA and ATC work together to create testing areas where the rules are relaxed and entities are being allowed to test their BVLOS kit, but generally very difficult to achieve the standards that are required. First-person view exemptions, I mentioned that because there's been a few stories in the news recently, and it's become very popular with drone racing. It is possible to fly a drone with some goggles, and you're essentially in the driver's seat of the drone, and you can fly it as though you were on board. You don't have to be able to see the drone yourself, but you do have to have a competent observer who can see the drone. and they have to have a line of communication with you. So really limited use, really. Okay, so what happens if you breach the navigation order? Well, realistically, not very much. The CAA has very limited scope, really, for penalising misuse of drones. They can send you a letter, a written notice, to inform you that you have breached the air navigation order and that you must cease, and in future you must comply. Or they can conduct a criminal prosecution. Criminal prosecution clearly is not always going to be proportionate or feasible for the majority of breaches, and it's been acknowledged as an issue for a long time that really there's not much of a deterrent for misuse of drones. And as I say, the police are virtually powerless. They have no direct powers under the navigation order to search, to seize equipment. There have been a few cases reported recently where police have been alerted to a security issue. They've arrived at the scene and the drone user has packed their equipment away. The police are essentially powerless to order that individual to open the boot of their car and show them the equipment. So there are proposals in place, I'll talk about this in a second, whereby the police will be empowered. This was the subject of a recent consultation, again, which I'll touch on in a sec, giving the police more powers to do more about drone misuse. A few other laws that are relevant to drone use in the UK. Regulation 785/2004, mandatory insurance requirements for aircraft. Aviators amongst you will be familiar with this. Applies to all commercial operators of aircraft, and a drone is an aircraft, so it does fall within this regulation. It was never drafted with drones and unmanned aircraft in mind, to be fair, so you have to kind of read around and be creative with how you interpret it, but the industry generally accepts that all commercial operators must have a mandatory level of insurance. And that level of insurance for anything below 500 kilos is 750,000 special drawing rights, which is about £800,000. That's for third-party liability insurance. If you're a leisure user, it will only apply to you if you're over 20 kilos. So the majority of leisure use drones are less than 20 kilos, considerably less than that. So there is currently in the EU, which obviously includes the UK at the moment, no requirement for mandatory insurance for leisure users of drones below 20 kilos. Civil Aviation Act 1982, Section 76, strict liability for surface damage. Again, the aviators amongst you will be familiar with this. Strict liability of an aircraft owner for damage caused by the aircraft to any personal structure or anything on the ground. No need to prove negligence. So if the aircraft causes damage, the drone is an aircraft, the aircraft causes damage on the ground, and the person that's suffered that damage can prove that the drone, the aircraft, caused that loss, they're liable. The owner of the aircraft is liable. Rules of the air regulations will apply to anything over 20 kilos, applies to the more complex operations, requirements for rights of way, aircraft marking and lighting, things like that. Chicago Convention will apply to cross-border operations if they ever become a reality, which presumably they will, with beyond visual line of sight operations. You cannot fly into another signatory state's jurisdiction without permission. And the Data Protection Act and CCTV Code of Practice. This is the only mention I'll make of this. It's not directly relevant really for the majority of insurers. I mention it because some insurers are actually purporting to cover liability arising from data breaches and security breaches. It's a huge subject. It's a massive area of public concern, and a lot of the changes that are coming into the navigation order, and as the subject of the consultation that closed last week, that will eventually lead into drones bill and some primary legislation. There are measures there to address this. Okay, so yeah, I've mentioned changes to the air navigation order this year. We've had specific drone sections in the air navigation order since I think 2005. 2000 this year, changes were made to the air navigation order 2016, and that's just a list of what we have. So we have a new distinction between operator and pilot. I've talked about that already. It wasn't immediately clear why the regulators did this, but actually when you go into the consultation, which came out shortly after the changes came out for the navigation order, you see they're now proposing changes to minimum age restrictions. So really, I think it's to get around, we think it's to get around the kind of parent-child scenario where you have requirements on the operator, pilot, person who's in charge of managing the operation of that drone, and then the pilot who's actually the person flying, which could be a 12-year-old or younger. At the moment, there are no age restrictions proposed for pilots, so it's thought, the way that they've set out the consultation is that there will be restrictions on the operator. They will have to probably be a minimum of 18 years of age. They can enter into contracts, they can buy the insurance, and they will be responsible for ensuring that the pilot, who could be their child, a young child, is complying with the air navigation order. Pilot competency tests and mandatory registration. Two points that the Civil Aviation Authority and the Department of Transport have been talking about for years. First consultation from a couple of years ago identified these as issues. A major issue with leisure users, and leisure users do make up the majority of users in the UK and probably the world, is that they're just not aware of the rules. I was at a party recently speaking to some family members, and one of them has a drone, and he said to me, I looked into this, and the requirements, you've got to be at least 10 metres away from a person. Completely misunderstood, and he'd done his own research and somehow come up with this magic number of 10 metres. So all pilots will be required to sit down and do probably an online test if the drone that they're going to fly is over 250 grams, which is anything beyond a small type. The exact format of that is not yet known, and we're waiting for the CAA to come out with their details on how that will work. And that will be tied to registration as well. So all operators, not the pilot, the operator, the person with responsibility for management of the drone, will be responsible for registering that drone. This goes back to previous consultations where it was, and just issues generally, where operators of drones were involved in incidents, but then it was impossible to trace the owner of that drone or the pilot of that drone because they're not registered. So this is linked to a kind of a risk management perspective. Okay, so that was the changes to the navigation order. After the changes to the A&O, UK public. Oh, sorry, I've mentioned this already, but the pilot competency and mandatory registration is not in force yet. That comes into force in November next year. So it gives the CAA and the industry a little bit of time to kind of get up to speed on what the procedures will be and how that will work. And the DFT and the CAA are working with vendors to make sure that everyone's aware of what they will be required to do, leaflets in boxes, that sort of thing. So the public consultation, this closed last week. It ran for a couple of months, seeking comments from the industry, from the public on a number of matters. Some of them are there. There are some other issues as well, which I'll touch on later. Age restrictions, I've talked about, a very important issue. Mandatory flight information and notification system, FINS. So if you go back a couple of years and you look at how the DFT and the CAA were looking at how this industry was evolving, they'd identified that we're definitely at some point in the future going to need some kind of airspace management system. And this was when we started hearing rumours of an intention to implement a mandatory system of a user notifying via an online system, there could be their phone or their tablet, of an intention to fly some amount of time in advance of their flight, and that system will be used to track the data of their flight. The intention, I won't worry too much about the format, but essentially it's going to be a UK-wide system. The operator will go into their field of operation, an actual field, perhaps, and log on. They might have logged on half an hour ago, or they'll log on when they get there and they'll say, right, I'm going to fly my drone. It's this type of equipment. Here are the details, and I'm going to be flying for an hour. And that will then be available to every other user of that system, every other operator of drones in the area. So they can go on and they go, right, I want to fly in this field. Oh, wait, there's two other guys about to take off, so I better have a think about whether that's going to be safe. The intention is, we think, for this FIN system, which is probably going to be managed by someone like NATS, who manage airspace anyway in the UK, or it'll be a similar system anyway, a similar platform, that will eventually feed into a system for integrated airspace management, which will allow for autonomous operations, operating beyond visual line of sight, and safely with manned flight. And police powers, talked about the lack of issue already, the lack of powers already, and the lack of deterrent for a drone user to misuse their drone. So it's a number of proposals. It's proposed that the police will be empowered, possibly community support officers as well, will be empowered to command the flyer of a drone and pilot of a drone to land their aircraft, to prove that they have all of the necessary permissions and registrations in place. They will have powers to search, command the supply of information on that drone. They'll be able to seize the equipment, and they'll be able to issue fixed penalty notices for breaches of the navigation order, which is quite important. I think at the moment they're talking about fines of up to £300 for non-compliance with the A&O. So, query whether the police have the resources to manage that. You may have your own view on that, but it's definitely coming. The police will have powers to enforce against drone users. Okay, so that's the position in the UK. I'm just going to touch very briefly on what the EU are doing. I won't spend too long on it. It's quite interesting. This has been going on for a few years. The EU have had their own rounds of public consultation. This led to a couple of draft regulations that everyone publicly had access to and could comment on. And I believe the IUA actually did comment on that. There are three tiers to that, really. You've got the new basic regulation. The EASA is responsible for airspace management, essentially, in Europe. That basic regulation under which they are established had to be amended to give them power over drones, because previously they only had power to enforce rules over 150 kilos. And obviously, most drones are smaller than that. So the basic regulation had to be amended. And I mention that because it was expected to be quite a simple process, but actually it took a lot longer than anyone thought. So the drone regulation, which was supposed to come into force, I think initially they'd hoped to implement it towards the end of last year or early this year, was delayed quite badly. It's pretty much ready to go now. The new basic regulation came into force a few weeks ago, so we also have their power. There are specific sections in the regulation dealing with drones, safety standards, that sort of thing. Drone regulation is expected to come into force early next year. That will apply across Europe. Staged implementation, so a lot of the provisions actually don't come into force until 2 or possibly 3 years in the future. And new airspace rules. I'll touch on that later because there are initiatives in place, but we were expecting to see earlier this year proposals for how airspace was going to be managed going forward. So what does the EU drone regulation actually say? I won't go into too much detail, but there are actually parallels with what we're doing in the UK. And if you look back at the consultations that the DFT ran and that Europe ran, the DFT had said from quite early on that they want to comply with what Europe are doing, so that there are uniform rules at quite a high level. So regulation itself is actually quite a short document. It's only a handful of pages. The guidance that sits behind it, the methods of compliance, is vast. It's hundreds of pages. There are detailed manufacturing product standards, which is very interesting. That's not something the UK has done. Applies to all drones up to 150 kilos operating in the EU. No distinction between leisure and commercial, which is quite interesting. Most jurisdictions that have implemented rules do have distinctions there. I think the view really there is that if an operator is flying a drone and it causes damage, the fact that that operator was being paid for what they were doing is actually irrelevant. It's a risk-based approach. That kit, how heavy it is, how fast it's going, where it's being used, is the key factor. So it splits drones into 3 categories: open, specific, and certified. Open is very similar to the small unmanned aircraft rules that we have in the UK. Sub 25 kilos, operating within visual line of sight, up to 120 meters, just under 400 foot, I think that is. No authorization required by the authority, and no declaration has to be given by the operator. If they look at the table, they look across and they see that they are complying with the rules, they're far enough away from people, they have their registration and they have their testing, their competency in place, they can just fly. Specific is intended to cover almost everything else not in open, up to 150 kilos. So Again, this is very similar to the operating safety case that we have in the UK for commercial operators and operators wanting to work within close proximity to buildings and people. Operational authorization required, risk assessments, again, quite a detailed process. How that's actually going to work is not entirely sure, but it's thought it would probably be a lot like the UK's operating safety case. And certified is everything else. It's out of scope, very complex operations. The member states will have to regulate that themselves. Comparable requirements to manned flights. So beyond visual line of sight operations operating in congested airspace, their own taxis, if that ever happens, dangerous cargo, that sort of thing. And as I say, detailed product requirements from manufacturers and vendors. They've actually gone to quite a lot of efforts in, I don't have it here, but they have a series of classifications of drone, and they have these leaflets that they've come up with and huge lists of bullet points of what you must do to comply. Number one on the list, make sure you're adequately insured on all of them. So just a couple more points on the EU regs. Special zones of operation, so the CAA in the UK's case, but the member states will be able to specify relaxed rules or tighter rules in certain areas, tighter rules around airports, that sort of thing, and relaxed provisions for testing areas, say. Registration will be mandatory, similar requirements to the UK. Pilot competency will also be mandatory, and that will depend on the type of operation you are. If you're open, if you're the simple stuff, then online test, again, similar to the UK. And if you're specific and you're doing an operating safety case, an operating assessment, then you'll probably need to go on a course, a 2-day course, say. No mention of insurance other than that one leaflet that says make sure you're adequately insured. So there are no proposals, and no one's really talked about it. No proposals for mandatory insurance for leisure users or anyone, other than what is already in Regulation 785. I won't go through that, but that's just a kind of story so far, really, of how much work has gone into the regulations and the consultations in the UK and in Europe. As I say, we had the latest consultation was closed last week before last, in the UK, and that's expected to produce a draft drones bill, which were promised the end of this year. Okay, so just a couple of points on the technology and the practical issues. A couple of screenshots here, I'll explain in a sec, but the technology is advancing at an astonishing rate, and geofencing is becoming pretty much standard on most commercially available kit. That system on the left there, that's a screenshot from DJI's system. You can see, I don't know if you can see there, but there are zones there which tell the operator where they can't fly in. If you try to fly into a restricted zone, the red zone, it will physically stop the drone from flying into that area. It knows there's an airport there, it won't go there. It knows there's a nuclear sub-facility, that sort of thing, it won't fly there. They also won't fly above 400 feet. If you're clever enough, you could probably hack it to make it do those things. That's a separate issue. Drone assist. System on the right. So applications are becoming increasingly sophisticated, more readily available, cheaper, and drone users are encouraged to use them, and they do work. And drone assist is just one of those. That's run by NATS, who manage airspace in the UK, so they know their stuff. And you can see there's areas there. It's just west of London, and that's areas where you can't fly, near airports, aerodromes. And airspace is a massive issue, and for the industry to develop as it wants to, i.e. with beyond visual line of sight operations, it's acknowledged that airspace needs to evolve to cater for unmanned aircraft and to allow for integration of unmanned aircraft into urban airspace, which includes integrating with manned flights. So U-Space is the EU's initiative that, as I say, enables access to urban airspace, to unmanned aircraft. The technology eventually will be in a position where it can identify threats. It uses sense and avoid technology, operates autonomously and safely with urban aircraft. They recently produced a roadmap, which is their mission essentially on what they want to achieve and how they want to achieve it. Very ambitious route they want to take. Fully autonomous operations by 2035. Now that seems like quite a long way off, but when you think about how a fully autonomous drone will have to operate in, say, around London, you've got City Airport, you've got lots of buildings, you will have lots of drones. They'll have to operate autonomously around each other and around all of those threats, and query whether the technology is there. There have been tests. Various entities have run their own tests, and they've shown that the technology is there. And one of the issues is the latency that you have with the communication links that you have. So 5G, when that comes in, that's expected to help this system along. And NASA has their own system, following a similar path. And just a couple of, actually, I have to acknowledge Nesta, who we pinched these images from. But this is the issue.
For educational purposes.
Sorry, pinched.
Seriously.
Shouldn't have said pinched. This is just a couple of images here of how vast the issue is. You're operating in an urban environment. You've got lots of aircraft. You have manned flights. You have small drones operating deliveries. You have drones running deliveries. This is a future scenario, of course. You have drones operating blood transfusion and donor organ transport. Perhaps you even have drone taxis operating. And this system has to be able to incorporate all of this airspace and all of the aircraft operating within it and manage them safely. Give priorities to certain types of aircraft. Do you give priority to a blood donor drone over an air taxi, for example? Probably yes. Lots of questions that are being asked and need to be answered. And similar picture here, again taken from Nesta for educational purposes. So again, aircraft, lots of different types of aircraft operating in the same airspace, competing for that same airspace, having to operate safely around each other. Okay, I think this is my last slide. Social acceptance and practical concerns. This social acceptance is a massive issue, and it's becoming more and more of a topic of discussion. Safety and security are obvious concerns when you speak to most people, particularly aviators. They will say, well, I just don't like the idea of these things flying around, potentially dropping things on me, on my property, flying into an aircraft that I'm in, or piloting even. And privacy, again, massive issue. I mean, privacy is probably out of scope of this talk, and it's a massive subject. And when you talk to most people, man on the street, woman on the street, one of their primary concerns is privacy. I don't want a drone flying over my garden and filming me in my speedos, or filming my kids. It's a genuine concern, and I think it's probably one of the issues that's going to be most difficult to address from a social acceptance point of view. Transparency and accountability, these are issues that are hoping to be addressed by the changes to the navigation order. So you're making users register the equipment, you're making them do an online test to prove that they have, at least at that point, understood what they're required to do and what they're not allowed to do. And the police will have more powers as well to enforce the restrictions and fine people when they're misusing drones. And environmental concerns. I mean, the majority of drones have quite short range, so the actual environmental impact is probably minimal when you're looking at a small amount of drones. But when you're looking into the future, if you're looking at 2035 and you have thousands of drones in the airspace and they're just used to fly pizzas around, is that an economical use of resources?
They're also noisy.
And they're incredibly noisy. If you've ever heard a drone, quite often I've been at National Trust places or that sort of thing, and someone has a drone there, they shouldn't, obviously. And it's like an angry swarm of bees. It's actually quite annoying. And if you picture the future where you have lanes of drones, dedicated airspace channels for drones to operate, that will represent quite a lot of noise. And I've been to a couple of seminars recently where it's been talked about, and the industry are aware of the issue and do accept that it's possibly going to be one of the major limiting factors, especially in quiet areas. When you get out into more rural areas, the noise could potentially be a massive issue for social acceptance. Barney will now talk to you about insurance.
Okay, I'll thank you, Stuart. I'll flip through this fairly quickly, but it's obviously the aspect of this which is probably going to tie it all together to the interest of people in this room. Drones are obviously, just as a throwaway comment, they are potentially useful as a tool to the insurance industry in relation to things like loss adjustment, getting real-time data and so on, risk management, accurate surveying and so on. I don't want to talk too much about that, but you know, there are uses you can make for drones just for your regular business across many lines. Okay, if you are looking at the world today, who insures drones, who's thinking about insuring drones, where are we as a big picture? The obvious thing about them is that they fly, right? Which means that for the aviation insurance sector, they understand a lot of the issues and risks that go and are associated with things that fly, and they tend to write policies which will cover much of what is associated with that. But on the whole, they're not particularly interested in insuring small things. You know, that's not where their capital is deployed at the moment. They're not going out there to try and find surveyors or wedding photographers, and they're certainly not insuring the man on the street who's bought his drone at Christmas. The other side of it, you've got other lines of business who are increasingly being asked, well, I've bought this drone and you're going to insure me on my household cover, or I'm starting to use a drone as part of my business to do aerial photography. Are you going to insure me in connection with that? And the general liability insurer needs to think about that. And therefore, drones, because they cover so many sizes and different applications, currently don't fit neatly into any one line of business, and they're not familiar territory for much of the insurance industry. Now, at the moment, there's a lot more talking going on about drones than there is actually sort of stuff happening in the economy. But that will change, and so the issues of who's insuring drones and how will become increasingly important. If you think what a drone is doing, it's typically up in the air in a position where it can either bump into something or fall on something, so there's a liability risk dimension. It is itself a piece of kit. It can be quite an expensive piece of kit, so if it gets damaged, there's an insurable interest there. It can be carrying equipment and or cargo, potentially. The person that manufactures it, as a manufacturer, he obviously has potentially got an exposure if something it doesn't work and the thing falls out of the sky. You're potentially already doing non-affirmative cover for some of your insureds if you've written a data protection extension into a liability cover, because where people are using cameras, they are potentially infringing data or privacy rights. Therefore, summarised what I meant at the beginning, drones are potentially an insurable risk for the aviation sector, for general liability insurers, for personal lines insurers. If you're thinking I want to go into the market and start underwriting drones, you're obviously going to need a product, a wording, something to do it on the basis on. People have come at this one from a range of perspectives. There are aviation wordings out there which can be adapted, or you can start putting extensions into other forms of cover. One of the obvious facts about non-aviation insurance typically is that it excludes aviation, right? So immediately you're looking at an issue of, well, I'm putting carve-outs into an exclusion, what am I doing? So there are technical challenges in terms of what are you actually writing in the product, does that work? The liability insurers need to be aware in particular of a couple of things. Firstly, liability for damage to property on the ground is strict. Yeah. So all that case law about your policy doesn't cover contractual liabilities, it's only where there's been a negligent action. If you're writing a product which is intended only to respond where there's negligence, it's probably not fit for purpose because your insured liabilities could be strict. Another thing to sort of bear in mind about these wordings is that where you particularly you've got insurers trying to write carve-outs out of exclusions or put in extensions, they typically think, well, I want to be insuring drone use which is done in compliance with the law. The more specific you make your wording in terms of the current law as to whether that's achieved or not, the greater the hostage to fortune, because as we've seen in Stuart's very detailed sort of overview, the law is changing all the time. I suppose the biggest question we get asked, and we're the wrong people to ask it as lawyers, is, yeah, look, it's very interesting, all this stuff, Barney, but how do we assess the risk? And the lawyers typically say, well, we're not underwriters. But the obvious, I suppose, big picture thing is that there's not actually a lot of historic data out there on which to model risk, to price risk. Yeah? Now that may change, particularly if we get a FINS mandatory flight logging system where the data is potentially put into the public domain. But you'll see that there are sort of increasingly products out there. One that's had a lot of, I think, publicity recently is something called Flock, which is backed by Allianz, where the underwriting approach was essentially getting the rocket scientists, the big data guys. So Flock was started by a guy called, I think, Klinger, a young guy out of Cambridge University with an engineering background. And he and his team, who are all, to look at their website, were about sort of in their 20s. I mean, very, very young, dynamic, clever people. You go online to buy pay-as-you-go insurance for your drone, essentially there are data collection services getting, real-time data from huge data sets. The smart guys have built astonishing numbers of algorithms that crunch through that and can price the risk on a flight-specific basis in about half a second and quote you. So it's sort of lemonade in the sky type thing. We may see that sort of cutting edge of insurtech being increasingly to the fore with drones because at the moment this is an unknown area for sort of how do you model it? Probably not off past conventional underwriting experience because there isn't any. So anyway, insurers who go into this need to understand: are they insuring the liability risk? Are they insuring the hull risk? Are they insuring the lot? Are they insuring commercial operations? Are they insuring people who know what they're doing? Stuart's, I think, responsible for a lot of these sort of individual bullets here, and you can go through them at your leisure, but they're sort of an idiot's guide to what are the things I need to think about when I'm insuring something that goes in the sky. At a really practical level, we don't see many claims involving drones. I think we've had one, Kennedy? Yeah, and it may have been because the insurers were concerned that there was a potential sort of fraudulent claim element. I mean, it was being lawyered because it was potentially sort of a questionable claim rather than because there was anything complex about it or drone related. A drone fell out of the sky and hit a car. No one in the car, didn't happen on the road. We're not talking about huge sums of money on the property value. The biggest issue actually for the loss adjusters they find, we understand when they deal with drone losses, is that because the technology evolves so fast, the kit is changing so quickly, equipment becomes obsolescent almost as soon as it's in use, in commercial use, and therefore you've got issues about, are you replacing like for like, betterment, all that sort of stuff, conventional adjusting issues. I've covered that really already, but at the moment, insurers are having to think about a range of issues in terms of how they approach this in pricing, some of which basically tie to, do I know my insured? Do I have comfort really that the people who I'm insuring understand what they're doing with this technology, understand the law, understand the regulations, and have complied with all that? Now, as the law gets more and more prescriptive about what you need to have done in terms of the competency requirements, in terms of registration, the more of that, essentially, the questions will write themselves, and it can become more tick box. And it is worth understanding, what drones are being used for. Clearly, somebody who's flying a drone to survey agricultural land, or is flying a drone over areas of waste tundra in Eurasia to keep monitoring pipelines, the relative likelihood of that killing someone or flying into something high value may be quite different to what happens where you start using drones around sensitive infrastructure or built up areas. And the risk, I suppose, is that if drones and their use, commercial use, start to be insured too enthusiastically in a soft market by people who haven't really thought through the potential exposures, we could see some sort of quite bad losses being insured, or bad risks being insured with the inevitable consequences. Again, you can go through these, because I've talked about it in general terms. So our final thoughts we and a number of other sort of people are occasionally in conversation with those in government about what they're planning in terms of changing the law, getting a bill passed to get our domestic laws as up to date and fit for purpose as possible. And the point we repeatedly make when we speak to people like MPs or when we respond to the consultation by the Department for Transport is if the government wants to see drone use accelerate and grow and create jobs and skills and high-tech activity in the UK economy, it's going to want the insurance industry on board to provide the risk management solution to allow everyone to be comfortable about that happening. And our perception is that there isn't actually as much dialogue going on at the moment between the Department of Transport and the insurance industry as you might expect. But I suppose we're all part of that dialogue in terms of just being aware of things that are being discussed, what's in the public domain, what's being done. The more people who have an interest in this talk to other people, the quicker we'll get to a situation where the necessary steps are taken. Probably the most exciting technical stuff on this, if you're interested in it from a nerd perspective, is in the airspace management issue. But it's once the airspace management framework has actually been decided upon by government and the legislation starts to really focus and take shape in that area that I think we'll start seeing drone use really take off. And at that point, everyone in the industry will probably be aware of drones, not because they'll be more important to the economy or to business than cars. I can't see that happening, but they will be quite a big thing eventually. And the airspace management, I think, is probably the single most complex and difficult area of that to see bottomed out. So what's the future for the insurance industry? Everyone from brokers or cover holders selling personal lines to high net worth individuals, increasingly just household policies, through to people in the aviation space looking for opportunities and looking to redeploy capital, are going to be increasingly looking at drones and wondering where the opportunities are and at what point there is going to be sufficient demand and sufficient profit opportunity to really get in and get involved. And we're not there. The drones are still something which people are talking about rather than being where the big money is, obviously. But we're reasonably on board with PwC's vision, which is that drone use, commercial drone use in particular, and recreational drone use are going to become a bigger thing increasingly. They will be economically significant and they will provide opportunities, including for the insurance industry. Where the caveat comes is the idea that we're all going to be getting our pizzas or products from Amazon Prime delivered by drone. And there's a lot of practical reasons why that might be something that never happens or is going to take a lot longer to happen than people expect. So that is our touching on a range of issues in connection with drones. We're conscious that we're speaking to quite a varied constituency, some of whom obviously are, if you like, expert in the aviation side of it, and some of whom are obviously potentially very personally knowledgeable about drones through personal use. But we've hopefully given you an overview of some of the major issues that we think are going to be to the fore in relation to UAV and their use in the UK in the next coming years. So at that point, I'd like to open it up to any questions.
Assuming we're still within the EU at the moment,
yeah.
How come the regulations being forward are so diverse? Just reading that thing all Europe.
Well, I mean, the first thing is if they're seen as being entirely diverse, I think we've probably given the wrong impression in the talks, Stuart. They're not actually that far apart in many respects, are they?
Not really. If you boil down the NPA, the Notice of Proposed Amendment, the draft regulation from Europe, there's actually quite a lot in there. Requirements for registration is a major issue, and that mirrors almost exactly what will happen in the UK. Pilot competency. I think the DFT has tried to, with the consultation for changes to the A&O, has tried to maintain parallels on the really important issues like registration and pilot competency. There are some differences, admittedly, the distinction between leisure and commercial users. But essentially, I think on the really important points, there is when you it takes an awful lot of time to get down to those, because there's a lot of information and it takes a long time to read it all. But when you boil it down, there are quite a few parallels. I think the DFT acknowledges that if we are to be in a position where we can export our expertise and our products and our services, that we need to be on the same page as the rest of Europe.
Yes, just think about airspace management system for a second, perhaps slightly forward-thinking question. Could you see a scenario where InsurableS gives users perhaps a full sense of security about the number of users in a particular area, perhaps people haven't used systems they're meant to, or if the provider themselves is actually relaying inaccurate real-time information? And then could you see some liability actually on the part of the business provider if the information provided is inaccurate?
Okay. Obviously, in terms of who potentially could be liable to anybody in connection with the fins will rather depend on who actually is operating and providing the fins. The general position, obviously, in the UK is that authorities operating discharging a statutory authority are not immune from civil liability in all circumstances, but they're, in crude terms, quite a hard target. I'd be quite surprised if we got to a situation where the courts viewed fins data, unless it was grossly materially inaccurate, as being a sort of culpable cause of drone use causing liabilities, but nothing's impossible.
You know, fins is kind of the first step to airspace management. When you look at what the EU is doing and what we've done in the UK, we're quite far behind U-Space. We don't have, as far as I'm aware, the complex tests set up, and we're not proposing specific rules for how that's going to look. And we should already have had an MPA, draft regulations and draft framework on what U-Space should look like. That's kind of been delayed, obviously, because of the delays with the rest of the legislation in Europe. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I mean, in big picture terms, the better thought out and the more advanced a functional operating kind of framework for controlled drone use is in place, better for everybody.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Barney and Stuart. That was really interesting. I'm aware that we've got to 2 o'clock and some people may have to rush off. If anybody wants to stay behind to ask specific questions, I'm sure they'd be very happy to answer. But please join me in thanking them in the usual way.